Hello boys and girls, welcome back to our next chapter of Mr. Mousey, Beyond the Silver Sea. Of course we left Mr. Mousey thinking just before he went to sleep, how was it they escaped from the marsh wolves? And the only logical explanation is that the carpet that covered them must somehow be a magic one. So let's see what happens, in next chapter, which is called chapter 6, Kirak. Anyone looking down on the scene below would have done well to have spotted the sleeping adventurers, so well were they disguised in the dale by the starlit riverbank. Scarcely a breath of wind so much as rippled the canvas over their heads, which was indistinguishable in colour or form from the landscape around about them. If anything, a slightly more regular shaped boulder may have caught the passing attention of a traveller familiar with these parts, but no more. The world turned, the stars slowly passed overhead, and the river bubbled by, needing no light of day to follow its ever unceasing passage. As the small hours began to lengthen, the eastern horizon could be seen to pale. Slowly, slowly, the sky at that point changed from black to washed out hues of far-off fires, and then those pallid colours deepened and warmed to ochre yellows and burnt orange. Before light had gained the power to throw fingers of shadow over the rolling hills, the birdsong began. A few courageous soloists split the silence, and encouraged by these dawn breakers, a chorus of twittering and whistles joined in. By the time the sun had popped his face over the eastern hills, the woods had come alive with scurrying and rustling. Woodland creatures are early risers and see no reason to lie in when the night has passed. Both Mr. Mousey and Mr. Rabbit awoke at around the same time. Both were thinking similar thoughts. Even if Mr. Rabbit was thinking rather more of them, both began to do something about those thoughts, although it was Mr. Mousey who first put them into words. Breakfast? He said. Breakfast, replied the rabbit, who saw no reason to waste good eating time by going into a full-length conversation about the obvious. Soon they were busy unpacking their supplies, and Mr. Rabbit got slightly ahead whilst Mr. Mousey took down the canvas cover and folded it into a cushion to sit on. I can't believe how much stuff I wasted last night. Imagine throwing perfectly good edible food away. It would drive a rabbit to tears, moaned Mr. Rabbit. The mouse looked up incredulously at his pal. Mr. Rabbit just winked. Only joking, he said, but looking down again at his breakfast, quietly added, sort of. Mr. Rabbit gave thanks for them both this time, and soon Mr. Mousey was tucking into banana and cheese with brown bread, while Mr. Rabbit settled for the last of his turkey with pickles and brown sauce. Mr. Mousey relit the fire from the night before, and after a trip to the water's edge, soon had a small kettle of water bubbling. In no time at all, tea was brewing, and the two friends lay down on the carpet, facing one another as they shared oat biscuits. Well, said Mr. Mousey, how do you feel now? About last night, you mean? Yes, about last night and about our adventure generally. I feel a lot better than when I thought I was about to die with ever having seen my Aunt Mabel, that's for sure. Mr. Mousey looked questioningly at the face in front of him. I didn't know you had an Aunt Mabel, he said. I don't know either, replied the rabbit, but it sure looked as if for a while there last night, as if I was never going to find out. He nibbled at his biscuit. Anyway, I feel better after I woke this morning and found I was only dreaming. Only dreaming? I'm afraid not, old chum. Those wolves were as real as we are, and as for the rug, why, no, interrupted his pal. I know that was no dream. I mean, I'm glad the dream I dreamed last night was only a dream, even if it bothers me a little bit. Well, Mr. Mousey had had vivid dreams himself during the night. I was interested to hear what his friends' dreams were. He asked Mr. Rabbit to tell him. Well, actually, it's a little bit embarrassing to be honest, but I'll tell you anyway. I dreamed that we woke this morning and got ready to go home. You said we couldn't, and when I said, why ever not, you went on about being on a rescue mission and we had to carry it out, and we would be wrong to just go home and forget all about it. Oh, said the mouse in a somewhat surprised voice. So what did you do in your dream? What did I do? Well, I went home on my own and left you to get on with it by yourself. He looked up at his friend in a kind of sheepish fashion. Was that all there was? Asked the mouse expectantly. No, there was more, continued the rabbit. When I was at home in my dream, I just couldn't get Owl's words out of my head. Day in, day out, he kept repeating them, and in the end I felt sick to the heart and wished I'd stuck to my friend. Mr. Rabbit's eyes were glistening a little bit as he said this. The dream had quite evidently affected him. Mr. Mousey looked tenderly at his pal. No matter either of their feelings, and like us, creatures aren't immune from them. No one could ever accuse Mr. Rabbit of being an unfaithful friend. At times he may not have displayed the more open courage of Mr. Mousey, but where it concerned his best friend, he would go to the ends of the earth or even risk his very life for him. Mr. Mousey could see quite clearly how a dream like that, where he did something so much on his own and left his friend behind, he could see how that would trouble him. But what do words of Owl's do you mean? What are the words you're talking about? Asked the mouse. He couldn't think of anything that Owl may have said that would have seemed a rebuke. Oh, you probably didn't half hear them, but I remember them because I know he meant them for me. He cleared his throat as he mimicked Owl's deliberate speech. An adventure like this, once begun, is best finished at its end. The funny thing was that Mr. Mousey's dream had involved almost the same type of thing. In it, he was trying to convince his friend to come with him, but not getting the right words to persuade him. It was looking now as if he wouldn't have to. Mr. Rabbit was looking at his friend, who was deep in thought. Of course, you wouldn't dream of giving up. But as for me, I'm just not. He was cut short by his friend. Since when have you ever given up, Mr. Rabbit? When have you ever let anyone down? I could never do any of the things we've done together without you. And what other rabbit that you know of would stay up the night under a tent, lying on a magic carpet, not 2 miles from where he was nearly eaten only the day before? Mr. Rabbit listened to his friend and liked some of what he said. He liked the way Mr. Mousey made him feel genuinely valuable. He didn't like being reminded of nearly being eaten to death, but something else caught him unawares. Magic carpet? Did you just say magic carpet? Well, Mr. Mousey actually hadn't meant to say it, but since he had and the subject was well and truly brought up, he decided to try out his theory on Mr. Rabbit. Well, just look at it. The two animals inclined their heads down at the pile below them. Does it look odd or unusual to you? Mr. Rabbit looked at the patch between them. Much of it was actually covered in biscuit crumbs. Looks like a rug to me. Maybe needs a bit of vacuuming, but it just looks like any old rug. Beats me why you're so excited about it." "That's just it," replied the mouse. "There's nothing about it. It sets it apart, nothing unusual, nothing strange in appearance." The rabbit looked straight at the face in front of him. There were times when he found Mr. Mousey's way of thinking decidedly weird. "So, well, we agree then. It's just a rug. That's what I said. Are you all right, Mr. Mousey? Did you bump your head when you fell yesterday? Hello? Hello? 1, 2, 3. Look, how many fingers have I got up?" Well, since rabbits do not technically have fingers, this last part may well have sounded like a trick question on Mr. Rabbit's part, but not likely, to be honest. No, the fact that there is nothing unusual looking about the carpet is the very reason to ask why at least a couple of hunting wolves didn't even seem to see it. He was idly following the pattern of the pile with his finger and holding the edge of the carpet as he thought aloud. And even if they didn't think to look under an old rug lying in the path, which again I say is hardly likely, why didn't they just simply smell us out? Mr. Rabbit was listening, rubbing his paw along the edge of the carpet, and he was finding it hard not to see some point in what his friend was saying. "So you think it can make folk invisible or something like that?" "Something like that," nodded his pal. "Do you think it sounds silly?" Well, the rabbit thought it sounded more than silly, and if anyone else had said it, he wouldn't have wasted too much time in telling him, so he was just about to suggest that possibly the wolves, in fact, did know that they were there, but got frightened when they realised who they were dealing with. Yes, indeed, brave Mr. Rabbit was lurking underneath, ready to leap with fearless strength upon any poor wolf who dared to challenge him. Well, he quite liked the way this thought was proceeding, and, as I said, was just about to suggest it to his friend when they were interrupted by a visitor. "Oh, this is a surprise," said the loud, rasping voice. The mouse and the rabbit had not been taking any notice of their surroundings as they chatted, and so they jumped when they heard a noise. Standing on the edge of their carpet was a large gull. This close, it looked very large indeed. A big yellow beak tipped with a red dash swung about, and two very beady eyes looked curiously at the two animals before them. Its head was startlingly white, as was its body except for wings, which were a clear grey. Around its neck was a bulky leather satchel fastened by a single strap and buckle. Standing on the rug, the webbed feet were colourfully red. "Surprise!" cried Mr. Rabbit, who had nearly jumped out of his skin. "I'll give you a surprise, you bundle of feathers. Why, you nearly scared the wits out of us, and stop waggling that ridiculous nose of yours all over the place, unless you want it knocked off your silly face." Well, Mr. Rabbit found it hard to be civil sometimes when he was caught unawares. What Mr. Rabbit means, Mr. Mousey quickly put in, is that we weren't quite expecting you. I'm sorry if we seem a little bit on edge.
"Oh, a little on edge? Ha ha! Ha ha! That's a good one."
He turned his head and called over his shoulder.
"Did you hear that, guys? They say they're a little on edge. Ha 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 ha!"
Circling just above them, the friends now noticed a number of other gulls. Maybe 6 or 7, it was hard to tell. Some kept flying so low that sight of them was lost for a moment. Somehow that didn't seem right to Mr. Mousey. They were making noises that he reckoned to be laughter. His attention, however, was taken again by the gull standing in front of them.
Ha 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 ha! So, how do you do it without wings? I have to admit, it's the first time I've ever seen a mouse or a rabbit do it.
Mr. Rabbit still hadn't got over the initial shock and was a bit perky.
"Do what without wings, bird brain?" he asked. "Fly, of course."
Mr. Rabbit and Mr. Mousey both reacted differently to this last piece of information. Mr. Rabbit's was to jump to his feet and square up to this not too smart bird. He reckoned it needed a good punch. But where do you land a punch on a bird? And could it punch back? It was at this point he looked down and saw, with a jolt, that there was an awful lot more of it that seemed anywhere decent. Too much down. Mr. Mousey had responded by merely turning his head to the right. What ought to have been his mug, which he had set on the grass just beside the carpet, well, what he actually saw was very, very different. Have you ever been really high up, say on a mountain on a very clear day, and looked at the land far, far below? It's like a miniature world. Fields stretch out in a green patchwork quilt, and here and there rivers flow by with spindly roads running along hedges. Toy woodlands crop up in scattered groups, and spotted about you might see some little white houses. You could easily imagine that you're flying, except for the ground beneath your feet, reminding you that you're just simply standing on a hill. Well, if you can imagine that, then you'll have a pretty good idea of what Mr. Mousey saw over the edge of the carpet. Below him, very much below him, lay woods and a river. To the north he could see the outlines of mountains, and to the far south a shimmering silver line took up half of the horizon. He was thinking, this must be the southern sea, far, far to the south and east of home, when his thoughts were rudely cut short by a screaming, "Ah! Help! Mr. Mousey, I'm falling!" He spun his head to the right, just in time to see a very imbalanced rabbit topple off the end of his side of the carpet. Mr. Mousey tried to react, but it just wasn't fast enough. The last he saw of Mr. Rabbit's fluffy tail was as it disappeared over the edge of the carpet and was gone. Mr. Rabbit!" he cried uselessly over the side. All he saw were the flailing arms and legs of his best friend falling to certain death below. "Ah!" said the gull, who was still on the rug, but peering with his sharp eyes down the way the rabbit had gone.
"Ah, doesn't actually look like he can do that without wings."
He glanced back at Mr. Mousey.
"Here, hold this bag. It's for you anyway."
The gull dropped the satchel on the carpet, craning its neck over the side, and without another word it dived straight down in the direction the rabbit had gone. Mr. Mousey's mouth still lay open in shock and horror, but as he watched the scene unfold before him, the tension increased. The gull, after momentarily spreading its wings, had now pulled them in tight to its body. They were in close and pointed backwards, while its feet were tucked in below its tail. Two of its friends plummeted either side of it, so that for all the world they looked like a trio of fighter bombers screaming down on their target. Mr. Mousey didn't know how fast a seagull could fly, but he had never seen anything so impressive in speed in all his life. But would they be fast enough? He worried. It was obvious what the gulls were trying to do. They were attempting to catch the hapless rabbit before he made an almighty hole in the ground far, far below. But Mr. Mousey hardly dared hope they could do it. That they were rapidly catching on him was undeniable, however. The gulls had pulled their wings almost closed, and the buffeting of the wind as they cut through it at an incredible and increasing pace was making it difficult to hold formation. But when it comes to flying, a gull can perform virtual miracles in the air. Below them, Mr. Rabbit may well have even heard the following diving scream, had it not been that he was doing a fair bit of screaming himself. Actually, he was well into his third scream, since they were very high up, and one breath hadn't lasted anywhere near long enough. Mr. Rabbit was absolutely terrified, but also a little bit annoyed.
"This is ridiculous,"
he was thinking to himself. "First, I nearly get walked to death, but heroically survive. Then I fight off an entire herd.
or whatever you call them, of wolves. And now here I am about to die in the most stupid way. I mean, how embarrassing.
And how did Mr. Brave Rabbit meet his untimely death, people will ask? He fell off a carpet.
I mean to say.
The ground was rapidly coming up to meet him, and not knowing what else to do, he threw the remainder of the biscuit he was still holding at it. Just as the end seemed totally at the end, he felt something take a vice-like grip of his tail and each of his ears. In the middle of the pain, he became aware that the onrush of ground had slowed up. Within seconds, he realised he had reversed direction, and he was now headed back the way he had come. In that it appeared he had at least a few more seconds of living to do, he was curious enough to twist around to see what was happening to him. It wasn't easy with his ears being pulled up.
"Ah!"
said the gull, holding his tail between clenched beak, and then gave a sparkly wink. His massive wings were steadily beating the air, creating a great downdraft of wind. Not only his wings, but also the beating of two other gulls, each of which was grabbing, with none too gentle a grasp, his hurting ears.
Still, no time to complain, I suppose,
he thought to himself. Within a minute, he was looking down on the carpet at the ecstatically happy upturned face of the mouse.
"Ah, thank you for saving my life, Mr. Gull,"
he said to the gull holding onto his tail. The others let go of his ears, and he hung suspended by his tail.
"Ah, my pleasure,"
said the gull, opening his beak, causing Mr. Rabbit to begin falling all over again.
"Oh no, not again!"
His cry was cut short by the simple fact he had landed on his mouth on the carpet. "Ah, Mr. Rabbit! Oh, thank goodness! What a rescue! I thought you were dead!" exclaimed the jubilant mouse, making sure he had got a good hold of the dizzy rabbit.
"You thought I was dead from up here? You want to have been down there?" He pointed, without looking over the edge of the carpet. "It was worse than thinking I was. I was sure I was dead."
The mouse managed to get his friend to sit down, and they turned their attention to the gull, who had once again settled on the carpet alongside them. I don't know how I can ever repay you for what you've done today," began Mr. Mousey.
"Ah, don't mention it, Mr. Mousey. Although it was quite hair-raising there for a while."
But how do you know my name?" asked the mouse. He was sure he hadn't told him.
"Owl told me. He said you would be travelling with a rabbit and may have had a few adventures. That sort of experience always shows on a person, you know. Stay-at-home people have a less wild look about them. We know, we are forever on the wing, and one wild look recognises another."
At this he gave the mouse a mischievous and knowing look. "Owl? But I don't understand," said Mr. Mousey. "Do you know Owl?"
"Everybody knows Owl,"
replied the gull.
"It was he who sent us to find you and give you that."
He pointed with his beak to the satchel lying on the carpet.
"But we've done what we came to do, so we'll be heading off. We've missed a good bit of fishing time already, unless you count fishing for rabbits."
"But we don't even know your names," protested Mr. Mousey.
"Oh, I'm Kirak, and our flock is known as the Whalers. Yep, the Whalers."
The gull lifted off by simply spreading its wings and allowing the wind to lift it airborne.
"One thing I meant to say, though,"
he cried as he wheeled with his laughing friends in the air.
"Never send any more of those green courgette things down the river. Try growing grapes."
With that they turned, rose in the invisible currents of air, and were gone. The two remained sitting on the rug, looking at one another, at a loss of what next to do.
"Mind you,"
said the rabbit at last,
silly sort of thing to say if you're a bird."
"What's that?" asked Mr. Mousey, snapping out of his thoughts.
"Hair raising."
Hair raising what?"
"That gull Cackle, or whatever his name was."
Since Mr. Rabbit said no more, Mr. Mousey spoke again. "Yeah, Kirak. Yeah, what do you mean?"
"Well now, how can a bird have a hair-raising time if he's covered in feathers?" Seems like a silly thing to say, though I must say I've grown jolly fond of him and his mates all of a sudden.
Mr. Mousey listened and explained to his friend. I think he was joking. He was saying hair raising, H-A-R-E. He meant you. He was being funny.
"Yes, hair raising. That's what I said. And of course, every hair I had was standing on end. Some were even jumping off, especially round my sore tail."
Well, it was obvious the rabbit wasn't getting the gull's wee joke, and since Mr. Mousey wasn't so sure that he would find it just that funny, he decided to leave it at that. Mr. Rabbit had felt the power of a gull's strong beak, not only on his tail, but also on his ears. He was trying to rub all three at once, and this had the effect of causing the carpet to rock about way high up in the air in an alarming sort of a way. "I think perhaps we should find some way of getting this magic carpet back down," suggested the mouse, "and perhaps you could wait till we manage that before you go into a major rubbing frenzy." Well, the first thing seemed safe to do was to get into a position where neither was in any danger of falling off. It was a calm day, but at this height gusts of wind might spring out of nowhere and knock a standing creature off its feet. They found that lying alongside one another meant they had a bit of support and could keep the other one warm. Now that the major threat of dying had passed, the cold was making itself known. Also, their heads pointed in one direction, gave them the effect of allowing them both the same view. Mind you, when I thought it might be a magic carpet, I had no idea it might be a magic flying carpet," said the excited mouse.
"If I had known," replied the rabbit, "I think I might have stuffed it down one of those wolves' neck."
Well, this ridiculous idea caused Mr. Mousey to burst into a fit of laughter, in which he was soon joined by his pal. They laughed and chuckled for ages, and it made them feel almost normal again. As normal, that is, as you can feel 1.5 miles above the ground on a small rectangle of fireside rug. They were grasping the tasselled end of the carpet as they lay flat on their bellies, and it was while doing this that Mr. Mousey felt the label. He curled the end of the rug back towards himself and saw it stitched into the corner. Now, what kind of a label would a magic flying carpet have? He wondered idly. He peered at the print on the label. "Instructions," it pronounced.
"What's that you're looking at?"
asked Mr. Rabbit, looking over. It's an instruction label," answered Mr. Mousey.
"Oh, great. Let's get the washing machine out and follow the washing instructions. We may as well die on a clean carpet."
No, I don't think it's washing instructions," said Mr. Mousey, studying the label.
"Well, what kind of instructions does it need to use a rug?" exclaimed the rabbit, who obviously wasn't at all pleased with the carpet at all. "I mean, it's pretty obvious. I would have thought, to use carpet, walk on it. To not use it, do not. I wish I had seen that label when I saw it in the tree. I'd have gone for the not use it bit and stuffed it back in again."
Meanwhile, his pal had just about finished reading the fine text on the label, and now he looked up at the rabbit beside him. "It's flying instructions, how to make the carpet fly." Mr. Rabbit was suddenly very interested indeed.
"Does it say how to make it unfly?"
Mr. Mousey read aloud. "Mark 3 carpet. To render oneself absolutely invisible in sight, sound and smell, crouch under carpet with eyes closed." Mr. Mousey smiled. "I think that part we already know. He did find it satisfying to have been proved correct in his guess about the invisibility, however.
What about the flying?
Asked his friend impatiently. Hang on. Yes, here we are. To cause the Mark III to rise, take a firm grip of both the long, untasseled edges of the carpet and pull upwards. He was interrupted again by the rabbit.
Rise? Is that rise the same as go up? Excuse me, Mr. Mousey, what about disrising? I've had enough about up for one day. See if there's any sort of downwards, gentle downwards.
Mr. Mousey had come to a part about how to make the carpet move forward, backward, and even some fancy flying, like steep banks and loop-the-loops. But thinking better of that, he read on. Oh yes, here we are, he said, reading further on. To descend, merely push edges of the Mark III down at the same point where pulling makes the carpet rise. He stopped and turned again to his friend. You know, we must have been fidgeting with the carpet when we were chatting down in the dell and accidentally pulled up on the edge of the carpet.
So what do we do exactly? Asked the rabbit, and how do we stop it going down too quickly?
He had had enough experience of going down quickly, and he was in no mood for a repeat performance. Well, to begin with, it's going to take both of us, since I know I can't stretch across the whole width of this rug. Actually, Mr. Rabbit probably could just have managed it, but Mr. Mousey correctly guessed he wouldn't want to, and didn't want to embarrass him by making him feel as if he ought to. They were still lying flat on their bellies, so it was a straightforward task for Mr. Mousey to grab his side of the carpet with his left hand, and Mr. Rabbit to grab his side with his right. They pushed down as instructed, but very gingerly, with Mr. Mousey controlling their timing. Things were a little rocky to begin with, but after some adjustment and growing confidence, they started to get the hang of it. It wasn't long until they were descending at what they felt was a comfortable pace, and they were able to see the ground slowly appear to rise up beneath them. Soon the dell was clearly visible, and it was apparent that they were going to land back precisely from where they had started. With 10 feet still to go, Mr. Rabbit pushed himself up and began to exclaim, "We're back! We're back!" It was a sentence that was not destined to be finished. In pushing himself up, Mr. Rabbit also pushed his edge of the carpet down. This had the sudden and immediate effect of making the carpet turn 90 degrees on its edge, causing the rabbit to slide straight off and straight down. The unfinished sentence finished in a kind of loop as its speaker landed once again on its mouth, this time on the soft earth of the grassy dell. If the rabbit was surprised, he was about to have that surprise amplified, because Mr. Mousey found himself flicked upwards as surely as his pal slipped down, and he spun for a few seconds in the air before descending rapidly. His landing, however, was considerably softer than Mr. Rabbit's. In fact, his landing was the rabbit. "Oof, oof!" let out the winded rabbit. The two pals lay there for the few moments it took to check that they were, in fact, still in the land of the living and the land of the relatively unhurt. The carpet fluttered gracefully to ground, and it lay flat out, right side up beside them. Mr. Mousey rolled off his soft landing. "Are you okay?" said Mr. Rabbit. "Oh dear, you don't sound too good." Mr. Rabbit repeated this odd sound, which turned out to be him spitting out a mouthful of soil, before eventually managing to get a sensible word spoken. "Yuck! I think I've just swallowed half the planet." Well, almost sensible word. "Thank you for breaking my fall," said Mr. Mousey, despite the fact that there would have been no fall except for Mr. Rabbit. Mr. Rabbit was still spitting out bits of grass, and although he couldn't be sure of it, Mr. Mousey also thought he saw a worm squirming through the air. He decided not to mention that to his friend. That's quite all right, Mr. Mousey. My turn, I suppose." Since no other harm seemed to have been done, they dusted themselves off and took a look around. Indeed, they had arrived pretty much precisely in the dale by the river, and their packs and things lay scattered about as before. Something caught the eye of the rabbit, and he brought it to his friend's attention.
Whose bag is that?
He was pointing at the satchel that Kirak the gull had left. It had fallen off the rug along with the animals. Mr. Mousey stepped over and lifted up the satchel. It was left for us by your friend Kirak. He said Owl had asked him to bring it to us.
I wondered what he meant when he was talking about Owl sending something for us, said Mr. Rabbit, but I was too dizzy from my fall to take proper notice.
The little mouse had by now undone the strap and buckle and peered inside to see what the bag held. Ha ha! Clever Owl, said Mr. Mousey.
What is it? Some extra grub? Has he sent sandwiches?
No, replied Mr. Mousey. He pulled out the contents of the satchel. It was the book. The book that they'd left behind. Well, that's the end of that chapter for now. It's quite a long chapter. But, wow, a flying carpet? Whoa, where would you go on a flying carpet? Well, we'll need to read the next chapter of Mr. Mousey, Beyond the Silver Sea, to find out. Well, you take care, children, and look after yourselves and look after your family, and be good. God bless. Bye-bye.